My name is Bilgiç. I'm a faculty member at Boğaziçi University, where I'm chairing a working committee on academic governance. And on behalf of the committee, I welcome you all to this panel. The Magna Charta Universitatum is a document that was originally signed by 388 rectors and heads of universities from all over Europe and beyond on the 18th of September, 1988, which marked the 900th anniversary of the University of Bologna. It contains principles of academic freedom and institutional autonomy as a guideline for good governance and self-understanding of universities in the future. Today, Magna Charta Universitatum has been signed by 904 universities from 88 different countries. Boğaziçi University is one of the early signatories and was later accompanied by 32 more universities from Turkey. Former rector of Boğaziçi University, Professor Üstüner Güder, served as the chair of Magna Charta Observatory between 2009 and 2012. The Magna Charta Observatory monitors the status of institutional autonomy and academic freedom worldwide. They have recently issued a public statement and sent a letter to the president of Turkey via YÖK, Higher Education Council, to realize the benefits of autonomous universities as well. Before we start, let me introduce our distinguished panelists, and then we move on to the theme and structure of the panel. I will do that in the order that our panelists chose to speak. So I will start with Sijbolt Noorda. Sijbolt Noorda is currently president of Magna Charta Observatory, Bologna. He's a former president of the Dutch Association of Research Universities, president emeritus of University of Amsterdam, and a former board member of the European University Association. He received his formal education in the Netherlands, Groningen, Amsterdam, and Utrecht, and in the USA in New York City. Dr. Noorda writes and lectures on teaching and learning in higher education, about ideals and practices of internationalization, on open science, core values and governance issues in higher education institutions. He regularly reviews and gives advice to individual universities and national systems in the European higher education area. During the last 5 years in Finland, Germany, Georgia, Italy, Poland, Romania, Slovakia, Spain, the Netherlands, and Turkey. He's a member of the International Advisory Board of Tübingen University, of Amsterdam University College, of the Berlin University Alliance, and of ITMO University in St. Petersburg. During most of his career in positions of leadership in higher education, since 1983, he has been engaged in processes and arrangements for quality control and development in teaching and learning, as well as research activities. So we welcome Professor Noorda. Our second distinguished panelist is Catharine Stimson, one of the pioneers in the study of women and gender, a founder of feminist criticism, is also known for her role as a public intellectual and her public service, which includes her wide-ranging writing on the humanities, liberal arts, and the university. She is university professor at New York University and Dean Emerita of Graduate School of Arts and Science there. She is located as a senior research fellow in the Steinhardt Institute for Higher Education Policy and is an affiliated faculty member of the NYU Law School, of New York University in Abu Dhabi, and of the Department of Applied Statistics, Social Science, and Humanities at Steinhardt School in New York University. She was educated at Bryn Mawr College, Cambridge University, and Columbia University. She holds honorary degrees from many universities around the world. Her public service record is as illustrious as her academic career. She is now a member of the board of directors of several educational, philanthropic, and cultural organizations, including the governing board of Magna Charta Observatory. She was chairing the board of Scholars at Risk until December 2020. We welcome Professor Stimson. As for the structure of the panel, we're going to have 2 rounds for each speaker, about 10 minutes each, and the question and answer session at the end. Please do send your questions via chat. We will be monitoring them. Okay? And we will ask the panelists the questions at the end of the session. For the first round, we're going to start with Sijbolt Noorda, who's going to talk to us about academic freedom and the Magna Charta Universitatum document in a historical context for the modern university in Europe and the need for such a document. Is this document still relevant? What is its relationship to the Bologna process, which is usually confused in many minds? And why did 900 plus universities sign this document? Are the questions that we are going to ask at the very beginning. And then we'll give the floor to Catharine Stimson, who's going to talk to us about academic freedom and the US experience. And we're going to ask her, did the Americans have to fight for it, or was it handed over to them by the Constitution? And she'll also talk to us about common academic values across cultures. Okay? So before we continue on with the panel, it's usually hard to do this at the very end due to timing. I'd like to give some thanks or mention some thanks, definitely to the panelists for joining us, to David John Locke from the Magna Charta Observatory, our simultaneous translators, Seda Kurt and Tanyeli Demirer, and my colleagues Elif Ünlü, Erol Köroğlu, and Aybek Korugan for their technical help. So with that, I give the floor to Sijbolt Noorda to talk to us for the first part of this panel. Sijbolt, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Tanner, for your very gracious introduction. And dear friends and colleagues, it is an absolute pleasure to be with you in this meeting. Although remotely, I have the feeling that I'm spending these hours with you in the beautiful city of Istanbul on your beautiful campus. My first presentation will be on the historic role of the Magna Charta and Bologna Declaration, especially on the values that are important for academia and why this historical context still matters to us. About 30 years ago, a crucial alignment and association of European universities took shape. And usually we refer to it as the Bologna process. If you look back, there were two important milestones: the Magna Charta Universitatum of 1988 and the Bologna Declaration of 1999. It's important to realize that the Magna Charta Universitatum was university-driven. It was the European Rectors Association of that time that made the decision to issue that statement on principles of university. They did this because they saw a future coming of more cross-border collaboration across Europe. And they wanted to make sure that our shared values and ambitions were crystal clear. The Bologna Declaration and the Bologna process proper was government-driven. It was an association of ministers of education. And I believe one of them is in our audience, Agneta Blad. She was there in those days, and she was one of those who had the vision that Europe needed this alignment of ministries of education, of governance, to enable free and open collaboration across Europe. That led to the formation of what is now known as the European Higher Education Area. And also, a couple of years later, the formation of the European University Association. And Turkey was one of the early members. It was joining the European Higher Education Area in 2001, and it joined the EUA also pretty soon. And since 1988, 35 Turkish universities have signed the Magna Charta Declaration. And as a matter of fact, my direct predecessor as the chair of the Magna Charta Observatory is one of your former rectors, Üstün Erguder. And another former rector of your university, Gulay Barbarokoglu, was a member of the EUA board only a couple of years ago. So Turkey has been a cherished and active member in all these associations. The background of the Magna Charta statement was very clearly the will to express the core ambitions and values that universities should share if they want to collaborate across borders. And values in this context is used in the sense of important and lasting beliefs or ideals that people share in a culture, in our case, in the culture of academia. Values are very important because they are shaping our behavior, they are steering the direction we want to move, and they demonstrate to the outside world why we do what we do. So it makes sense to ask these questions. Why do values matter for universities? Well, several answers are possible, and many of them are true at the same time. First of all, they are informing and steering profile setting. What kind of an institution does our university want to be? What kind of interests do we want to serve? Who should benefit? For instance, in education, are we keen on individual excellence, or are we keen on inclusiveness, or both? Similarly, values are quality markers, like for instance in research. Integrity is a very important value there. And in the educational process, fairness is very important. They are also important because they are foundational principles of the institution. How do we understand ourselves? How are we positioned in society? And such are values like autonomy. The Greek word says it is the ability to set your own rules, and academic freedom. The freedom that we need for our inquiry, that we need to be able to follow our curiosity, that we need to create safe spaces of tolerant debate among academics. And I think autonomy and academic freedom are in a way like the two legs of a body. One cannot go without the other. Autonomy is more about the institution, about the schools and faculties, and academic freedom more about the individuals. Autonomy more about the ability to set your own profile, to set your own priorities, and academic freedom about the individual researcher and teacher and student to follow his and her own path. Values are also important because they are guiding us in international relations. If you're collaborating with a colleague in Pakistan or in China, in the United States or in South Africa, you want to know on which base we are working together. You want to recognize the values that you're sharing. So it is important to any university to not just proclaim values, but to discuss them, to make sure you share them. And this is even more important when there is political turbulence in the country, when there are competing claims to values and directions and profiles, and when there is division within an institution. Then one should not only talk business, but one should try to discuss and debate core values. Then, of course, the question is important which values we are talking about. And the answer to that will be different in different places. I have been part of these discussions worldwide in many different places and found out that we share common values across the board, worldwide, and at the same time, there is every good reason to have a local version or a local addition to the list of values. The common values are usually two enabling values. I mentioned them already: autonomy, academic freedom. Operational values: how do we go about things? How do we work? What is the work style, the quality of our work, like integrity and fairness? And social values, like social responsibility and equity. Because in all this talk about values, it is absolutely clear that universities are not selfish institutions existing for themselves, but institutions that are there for a purpose. For a university, it's not just important to know what we are good at. It's also very important that we realize what we are good for. And this is the social responsibility and equity side. This is our direct link to our societies, to our community, and to our worldwide community. As I said, sometimes there are country or profile specific values that are important, sometimes for the time, sometimes as a constant. I have heard them across the board in many different countries. Values like supporting national unity. I remember a discussion with universities in Malaysia where they repeated over and over again, our number one value, our number two value, our number three value is supporting national unity. The basis for our nation is, in other countries, embracing diversity, is providing life support to students, and so on and so on. So values are not only the common values that we share across the board, there are also country-specific ones and sometimes locally specific ones. And one might wonder what the benefits are of reviewing and discussing those institutional values. And it's basically to enable your university a community to enhance its performance in teaching, learning, and research, and above all, to strengthen its sense of community. In addition, it demonstrates to the outside world why a university is doing what it does and which values a university wants to instill in its graduates. In the Magna Charta 1988, some of those key values were expressed, and the core ones were independence and academic freedom. And I repeat, these were not meant to serve as selfish privileges, but they were meant as foundations, as crucial conditions for responsible universities to better serve their communities by contributing to the well-being and development of our societies. And that's why I quote at the end of this presentation the wording of that 1988 statement: to meet the needs of the world around, research and teaching must be morally and intellectually independent of all political authority and economic power. And on academic freedom, university life as a workplace of research and a meeting ground for teachers and students should be governed by freedom, openness to dialogue, and rejection of intolerance. And again, not as selfish privileges, but as a crucial condition for serving communities well. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Noorda. That was very timely and very nice, and it's going to lead nicely to what Catharine Stimson would have to say, who's going to talk about the US experience on these issues and how things came into being there. Catharine, the floor is yours.
Tanner, I am so eager for conversation amongst us all. How long would you like me to talk? 10 minutes, 12 minutes? I have a little clock here.
Totally up to you. You're allowed 12 minutes for the first round, so you can use it up to that or shorter or a little later. That's fine. Go ahead.
Thank you. Tanner, I wish to thank you and the organizers of the panel and all the Turkish academics who so courageously support academic freedom and university autonomy. I am honored to be with you, and I am humbled to be among you. Like others, I believe we're in a global crisis because of the rise of authoritarian governments, and the United States, in its recent election, barely avoided one of them. And of course, as we all know, authoritarian governments abhor freedom of expression and academic freedom. My task is to talk about academic freedom in the United States. And in theory, and in law, and in belief, academic freedom and institutional autonomy are well established. In practice, one must always struggle for academic freedom and institutional autonomy. In the United States, we can never take them for granted. I would like to do a very brief sketch of how it came to be established, academic freedom in the United States, and then some of our current difficulties. How did it come well established? Here are some milestones. After 1776, when the United States came into being, one great question was education. How should a new nation educate its people, especially its white male citizens? And the Enlightenment belief in education was very strong. Because of the variety among the colonial colleges established before independence, the US had rudiments of hybridity among its institutions of higher education. And that hybridity has evolved in the United States. We have public and private institutions, we have community colleges, we have universities. Centralized control is hard to create, but commonly asked questions are not. And one commonly asked question was, well, what would American university be like? And how might it serve a new democracy? And where did the leaders, the leading writers, the leading scholars, where did they seek answers? They went to Europe. In the 19th century, perhaps 10,000 American scholars and writers and educators came to Europe. They loved the Scottish universities. They liked the French universities. And they really loved the Protestant German universities, especially von Humboldt's University of Berlin. And of the many things they admired, it was freedom, the idea of inquiry as being ceaseless and endless. And they came back to found or to refound our great American universities. And in their speeches, like those of Eliot of Harvard, you see them very tactfully nudging religion to the margins. Theology was no longer the queen of the sciences. Yet this freedom, academic freedom, had to be won. For there were interference from the state, from the governors of institutions, from donors, people with money, and from bossy presidents. And in 1915, the professors, yes, the professors revolted. And they founded the American Association of Universities Professors. And the Declaration of Principles is the founding text of academic freedom in the United States. It's aware of both Lernfreiheit and Lehrfreiheit, but because they were professors, They were a bit more interested in Lehrfreiheit, freedom to teach. But they advocated not just freedom of teaching, but freedom of research and freedom of speech outside of the university, extramural speech. And this foundational 1915 document had other central points. Academic freedom had to serve a social good, creating truths and the conditions of truth. Universities did not have license. They were to serve society. And as Sijbolt has pointed out, what that meant varied. Next, academic freedom entailed responsibility. Service and responsibility, accuracy, for example, scholarly care. And third, academic freedom was inseparable from tenure. Tenure made the exercise of freedom far more possible. This statement, the great 1915 statement, has been revised. In 1940, for example, there was a restatement, but the principles, what Sijbolt is described as the legs of academic freedom and university autonomy, are always there. The 1940 statement, the common good depends on the free search for truth and its free exposition. The foundations were laid. There was a flaw, of course. The flaw was in the lack of access to the American university. And in the struggle for academic freedom, and let me do this in 4 minutes, in the struggle for academic freedom, after World War II, 4 developments were crucial. One, and Sijbolt will talk about this as well, I think, in our question period, the globalization of a belief in freedom of thought and commitment to it. In 1948, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights helped to establish a global basis for academic freedom. The UNESCO Declaration of 1997 was helpful. The UN Commission of Human Rights was helpful. And I have read the letter of the Commissioner of the UN Commission on Human Rights of 2020, rebuking Turkey, in part, for harassing and intimidating journalists, the media, and for neglect of academic freedom. In the United States, 3 developments, the courts, and we are so dependent on an independent judiciary, as our last US presidential election showed, the courts often rule for academic freedom. One case that I don't have time to go into in 1957, Sweezy versus New Hampshire. But it said, and Sweezy was declared a subversive. The state was trying to find him a subversive. But the Supreme Court said, the Attorney General of the state of New Hampshire cannot investigate his beliefs and associations. A second crucial internal development was the growing commitment on the part of religious colleges and universities to academic freedom. Remember, in the United States, we have secular institutions, we have Protestant institutions, we have Catholic institutions, and we have institutions based on other religious principles. There was a towering figure in Catholic education, the Reverend Theodore Martin Hesburgh, a man of enormous strength and prestige, who was president of Catholic University from 1952 to 1987 and said, we're going to be known for more than football. It's something called the Land O'Lakes Statements, named after a place in Wisconsin where he gave this speech. He said, a Catholic university must have autonomy and academic freedom in the face of authority of any kind, law or clerical. So 3 developments, the globalization of a belief in freedom of thought and a commitment to it. Secondly, the work of the independent courts, judiciary. Third, the most prestigious religious colleges and universities believing in the Hesburgh Statement. And the fourth, these huge demographic changes in the American higher education. More women, more African Americans, more Asian Americans, more Latino and Latinas, and therefore more questions. More questions. Freedom for many, not for a few. Our current difficulties are these. The belief that higher education must be instrumental. It must meet immediate economic needs and student employment needs. The belief that the disciplines that matter are economics, health, and engineering, and they're marvelous disciplines. But the belief that some disciplines don't matter, the humanities, and some methods don't matter, critical thinking. That is more than marginally disturbing to academic freedom. But our struggles are also over race and gender and ethnicity. And state actors and private actors and civil society organizations are all involved. On the left, if I may use that expression, some fear that academic freedom protects demeaning academic speech, even hate speech, especially about race and gender. Academic freedom is not seen as freedom, but as a protection for diminishment of the others. On the right, there are accusations that programs about race, gender, and ethnicity are biased, that they purvey anti-American propaganda. Powerful senators on the state and federal level have said, shut them down now. And then, and this is ironic, share the irony, my friends. On the right, there are also accusations that the left is silencing the right. Canceling them is the term. We have the unedifying spectacle of powerful US senators complaining, poor babies, that they are being canceled. To conclude, we know painfully about heroic scholars at risk. I am among them today. I also worry about scholars at moral risk. We have them in the United States. A scholar at moral risk has a comfortable, secure job at a university or a think tank. However, a scholar at moral risk refuses to come to the aid of scholars at physical risk or universities at risk. Immorally, scholars at moral risk ignore our common responsibilities to each other and to the academic freedom that has been won because of the sacrifices and struggles of others over the centuries. I hope I have not spoken too quickly. Let me thank you again for allowing me to be with you.
Thank you very much, Kate. This was not only very timely, but also was a great introduction to academic freedom and how it was earned in the US, and also gave us a glimpse into the future or the current situation and into the future as well. Thank you very, very much.
I thank you. Thank you again for having me.
Thank you. Now we're moving into the second round. And in the second round, we'll go with Sijbolt again, and to talk about how the new version of the Magna Charta Universitatum came into being. Why is there a need for it? And I'll also want him to elaborate a little bit more on what we have already heard, academic freedom and autonomy. Can you have one without the other? I mean, why is it that institutions have to be autonomous? They could really be free academically, whatever that means. Can they really need the autonomy as well? And Sijbolt, the floor is yours for another 10 minutes.
Many thanks, Tanner. Yes, indeed. My first talk was on the history, the value of it, the continuation of the importance of having shared values and ambitions at the institution, but also as the basis for international collaboration among colleagues. Since 1988, this European alignment that I sketched before has gradually linked up with worldwide collaborations. And we now see close to 1,000 universities worldwide signing the Magna Charta Universitatum. They come from all continents. In addition to the European higher education area, we at Magna Charta Observatory now work with the International Association of Universities, that is a global association of universities, and the Global Organization of Scholars at Risk. And we do this because we have seen that globalization is spreading university collaboration and spreading the movement of students across the globe, not just within continents. And against this background, it was felt that we also needed a fresh expression of our core values and principles, as well as of our responsibilities, to stand next to the Magna Charta Universitatum of 1988. And that's what the Magna Charta Universitatum 2020 wants to be. It was drafted in 19, it was defined last year, and it was to be launched last year in September, but because of the pandemic and the travel restrictions, we had to postpone its formal launch. And we will now do this in a remote meeting on June 16th, a couple of months from now. And I've added the link to that program. And this is also an invitation for all of you to join and be part of that meeting. An interesting symbol of how the new one is different from the old one is the difference in the two drafting groups. The drafting group in 88 was 8 male rectors of European universities, all in their 60s. The new drafting group was 4 women and 4 men from all continents, among them students, professors, university leaders, with a broad range of experience, sharing very different outlooks, different cultures, and different political systems. I was sharing that drafting group, and the experience itself was a pleasure to see how such a diversity can lead to the realization of shared ambitions and shared values. So that symbolic difference between those two drafting groups is hopefully shining through through the differences between the two statements. In the new statement, we are describing, of course, very succinctly and shortly, the changing circumstances in this kind of a statement. The world has since 1988 become interconnected in ways unimaginable at the time of the original declaration. Universities have proliferated around the globe, dramatically increasing in variety as well as in scope and mission. Globally, the number and diversity of students seeking a university education has increased tremendously. In Turkey, you don't have to look far. You see this in your very country. But if you look to a continent like Latin America or Africa, you see enormous differences happening only in the last 2-3 decades. Students have a new and very diverse interest in why they are seeking higher education, and they are looking at us at universities for a trustworthy education to guide them to their professional lives. I will now continue to share some highlights of the new Magna Charta Universitatum. You are able to read it all at your leisure on the website of Magna Charta that I will show shortly. We believe that despite all these changes, the potential of higher education to be a positive agent of change and social transformation in the world endures. The principles of 1988 are still as valid today as they are, as they were in 88. And they are still the necessary precondition for human advancement through inquiry, analysis, and sound action. Whatever challenge we're looking at, is it the challenge of our societies? Is it the challenge of our climate? Is it the challenge of renewable energies? Is it the challenge in health? Is it the challenge of inequality? In all these cases, it is the insights of scholarly work and the education of new generations of professionals that is going to help us through. And if we are not doing a good job there, we're going to fail the role, the potential of higher education for the world to come. These dramatic changes require the global academy to identify their responsibilities and their commitments. And we want this new statement to very clearly state exactly those responsibilities and commitments. So where the first Magna Charta was highlighting above all the main values and freedoms, we are now joining them with a longer list and more specific responsibilities and commitments. I will share some of the highlights, as I said. First of all, this is the first statement of those ambitions. Universities acknowledge that they have a responsibility to engage with and respond to the aspirations and challenges of the world, to the communities they serve, to benefit humanity and contribute to sustainability. These responsibilities are not an afterthought for science. They belong to the core of what universities are good for. We are often so much mesmerized by our own scholarly work as a goal in itself. But we shouldn't forget as academics that we do this for a purpose, that we do this to serve our communities and to benefit humanity and to contribute to sustainability of human life on this planet. A second statement is on intellectual and moral autonomy as the hallmark of any university. Again, not as a selfish privilege, but as a precondition for the fulfillment of its responsibilities to societies. Without that openness, without open curiosity, it is impossible to reach the kind of goals that we want to reach. And that independence, and this is a crucial statement, needs to be recognized and protected by governments and society at large. And last but not least, it needs defense, vigorous defense by institutions themselves. And to fulfill their potential, and for that purpose, what I just said, universities require a reliable social contract with civil society, one which supports pursuit of the highest possible quality of academic work with full respect for institutional autonomy. One of the next statements of the new declaration speaks about the civic role and responsibility of universities. They are parts of a global collegial network of scientific inquiry. We are never alone in this. No scientist, however smart, can work by herself. No academy, how well organized and how well funded, can do this all alone. We are parts of collegial networks worldwide, and we are depending on those networks. We are building shared knowledge on shared knowledge bodies, and we are contributing to their further development. We are all in this together. At the same time, universities are not just part of these global networks, they are also embedded in local cultures and crucially relevant to their future and enrichment. I remember doing reviews with Turkish universities, with South African universities, with universities in Russia, and in all those cases, these universities recognized that being part of global networks, and at the same time, the need to serve their local communities, to be relevant to the future of their nation and the enrichment of their local community. So we state in this new statement, while universities are immersed in and connected with global developments, they engage fully with and assume leading roles in local communities and ecosystems. It is very important to keep this balance and again, walk on two legs. One of the final statements of the new declaration speaks about academic freedom in terms of universities as non-discriminatory spaces of tolerance and respect, where diversity of perspectives flourishes. Universities should not be places of monopolies, should be places where debate and curiosity lives, diversity of perspectives flourishes, and where inclusivity anchored in principles of equity and fairness prevails. That's why universities signing this new declaration commit themselves to advance equity and fairness in all aspects of academic life, including its missions, hiring, and promotion practices. And it ends by a lofty statement saying that by signing the Magna Charta Universitatum 2020, universities declare their commitment to the original declaration and also to upholding and advancing the principles, values, and responsibilities of the new statement. And why do they do this? To strengthen the roles of universities in the preservation of the planet and promoting health, prosperity, and enlightenment around the world. That's a short summary of what this new statement is all about. And I hope you will join us on the 16th of June when we do formally launch this, and that your university and many others will make it clear that they are committed to this statement and the responsibilities it contains. I want to conclude by pointing to another aspect though. Proclaiming principles and ideals is important. It has a crucial task, both to universities themselves and to the outside world that should know what universities stand for. Yet, proclaiming is not the same as living up to them. So monitoring the actual situation, monitoring the actual realization of academic values and principles has become an important issue. It has become an important issue at the university, at the European higher education area. We have been working for years in a working group preparing part of the ministerial statement of November 2020 in Rome. And there, the ministers of the European higher education area, the 49 countries of this area, have stated they want to develop a framework for the enhancement of the fundamental values of the area. Remember, this is a statement not of universities, but of governance that will foster self-reflection, constructive dialogue, and peer learning across national authorities, higher education institutions and organizations, while also making it possible to assess the degree to which these are honored and implemented in our systems. So this is a plan, an invitation to be critical to each other, about each other, and look carefully at the situation in the various countries. Meanwhile, Magna Charta Observatory continues to keep track of and monitor developments concerning our signatory universities, both as to their internal situation, as well as in relation to their national authorities. Because we do know, and we continue to realize, that academic freedom and university autonomy are always underway. They're always interacting with the social and cultural dynamics of societies. The presentation of Professor Stimson just showed how that works in the United States, but we could make those statements and those pictures of every country in the world. It's that dynamic of societies that is interacting with universities everywhere. And we have to take care ourselves as academics and universities that we keep the right kind of balance there. Academic freedom and university autonomy are always depending on the degree of protection academics and universities enjoy on the part of local and national authorities. We cannot protect ourselves in the end. The Academic Freedom Index is an interesting and valuable new independent monitoring project. It relies on the reports of some 2,000 academics about situations in countries that these academics, each of them, are familiar with. And just last month, the 2020 version of this index has been released, and I add the link to it. And people in the know about this index have written about the Academic Freedom Index as a robust instrument for research to know about situations in different countries, but also as a tool to inform policy debates among government officials, among parliamentarians, among research funders, among university administrators, among academics, students, advocates. This report really has the ambition to further contribute to such debates. And I would like to add the ambition, the invitation of the project leaders to join the project and become one of those 2,000 academics, and hopefully it will be 4,000 next time, and 5,000 and 6,000 in the years to come, as an instrument that we as academics contribute to our colleagues worldwide. In conclusion, international association and alignment around core values of academic life have been a positive force for 3 decades now. I'm deeply grateful to our predecessors who had the vision to start that movement of solidarity and collegial support. In hindsight, it's remarkable what they did, how they found their shared ambitions and values. But they can't continue to work themselves. It's up to us to follow in their footsteps. And I'd like to invite all of you to continue doing exactly that. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Noorda. That was a wonderful explanation of why we needed the new Magna Charta. And I also want to highlight what you had just said. The academic freedom and institutional autonomy they have to go hand in hand. And they're not a selfish privilege. They are for public good. So I just would like to underline that from your statement. Thank you very much.
My pleasure.
Okay, so finally we came back to Professor Stimson. And this time she'll talk to us about Common Academic Values and the Living Values Project. However much you want to talk about, that's totally up to you. But I also would like to pose you a question. I'd like to get your answer to it. Did you find the definition of the European university, the modern university, too Eurocentric at the beginning? Is it like that? Is it really universal? And can you comment on that while you are talking about the common values?
The American university is indebted to the European university. And I think that's one of the strengths. If you read the 19th century founders or reformers, like Eliot of Harvard, or Daniel Coit Gilman of Johns Hopkins, or Tanner of the University of Michigan, they took crucial principles from the European universities. Again, the Scottish always had a special relationship with colonial America. But they took, especially from von Humboldt, principles by which we can still live, of inquiry as ceaseless. Another thing they were interested in, especially Tanner of Michigan, was the relationship of primary and secondary education to tertiary education. They saw a ladder of learning. And Tanner of Michigan was very interested in teacher training. And how do we prepare teachers to be a part of this ladder of education? Of course, the European university is awfully complicated. I hesitate to talk about the European university, but the American university created its own flaws. Our American racism. We, 1619, the first enslaved people came to North America. That's on us. That's on us. But what I think is really interesting is, what did we take that was good? What were the errors of our own in the United States? And then what is the act of reform and recreation? Every generation must engage in acts of reform and recreation, and we will be tested by how wise we were. And of course, the European university was enmeshed in colonialism. The first European university that came to the Americas, both North and South, was a Dominican, Spanish Dominican, what is now the Dominican Republic. And you should see its charter. I've read its charter, forgive me in translation. My Latin couldn't quite keep up with papal Latin. So that we have histories. Remember, we have histories we must understand, and part of the job of academic freedom is to look at history. And this is where some of the great cultural fights in America now are about teaching of history. And we must use our freedom to understand the scars of history and the possible strengths. I really want to go to discussion. I just wanted to say that the MCO, Magna Charta, one of its projects is the Living Values Project, which you can see on the website. It's been tested in 10 universities in 9 countries. And it is a series of suggestions for how a university can both build on the traditional values, what we've been calling the 2 legs, and also what's specific to that place. For example, in the United States, the historically Black colleges and universities would have a particularly intense sense of mission about race. So I think that Living Values Project, and I'm sure Sijbolt has been very important and has served as an ambassador for it. The second thing I want to mention quickly is the European Coordinating Committee for Academic Freedom, which is convened by Scholars at Risk Europe. And I'm glad to say that MCO has representation. And this coordinating committee, which is an advocacy group for academic freedom, has just been joined by Dr. Yaman Akdeniz, the pro-rector of Bilgiç. So I am delighted to see that Turkey and a Turkish academic is a part of this coordinating committee. But I am thank you for your question, Tanner. I'm so interested in what we all have to say. And
thank you. I know you want the questions, and yeah, in the interest of time, we can now move to the question and answer session. And please do send your questions to Elif Ünlü from chat so that I can actually see them here and ask the panelists. And I actually do have one, so let me start with that. This comes from our own Zeynep Gambetti. It's a question for both speakers. The Magna Charta Observatory issued a strong statement against the top-down appointment of a rector to Boğaziçi University. We know that in Brazil, Bolsonaro is also trying to change the procedures by which rectors are selected. Likewise, Greece is moving in that direction. Could you say a word about how modes of political intervention into university autonomy and academic freedom converge across the world? How can the Magna Charta help struggle against such encroachments? So,
it's a marvelous question. It's a marveless question.
Go ahead, please.
And I'm going to turn to Sijbolt on this one as chair of our governing council. But I begin by saying the rise of authoritarian governments is one of the hallmarks of our current moment. And authoritarian governments fear cultural and academic freedom. They go after the press. They go after the universities. They go after the independence. And the question that I would love, again, turn to the chair of our governing council for, what can all of us do? And thank God we have these global networks now. We have these global networks of commitment to academic values. But Sijbolt.
All right.
Thank you, Catherine. Well, I mean, you said earlier on that we are in a way facing a crisis of political leadership in many countries. And behind that are various factors. But one of the factors that is important for us to see is rather ironic. Universities in the last decades have become more and more important in many countries. They have become important school institutions. They have become important research institutions. And what is important in a country acts as a magnet for everyone that wants to have power and influence. Whether it's in business, in finance, or in politics, you see that happening. And if we speak about university autonomy and the freedom to elect your own leadership, your own rectors, your own deans, we see very worrying signals in many different countries. When you talk with our colleagues in Bangladesh or our colleagues in India, many African countries, situation in Brazil, in Venezuela, very, very worrying. And in all those cases, political authorities do not see that the lifeblood of the academy is freedom and autonomy. Not to be a state in a state, but to do exactly what we should do. proper education and smart research. You need freedom to be a good researcher, to be a good teacher. Otherwise, you are an ideologue and you are training instead of educating. So the irony of the situation is that the success of universities and the important role of universities worldwide has led to eagerness on the part of business leaders or finance leaders and political leaders, ideological leaders, to gain power and control those institutions. And that's exactly why we as academics, wherever we are, should stand united to fight that and to make absolutely clear that freedom is not seen and not to be seen as an independent private privilege, but as the precondition for doing our work in a proper manner.
Yes, this helps to account for my irritation is too mild a word. With the scholars that I described earlier is the scholars at moral risk. The scholars who do not see the need for this working together that Sijbolt has so eloquently described. I don't know how we all feel about the United Nations organizations, but I do know that UNESCO and the UN Commission on Human Rights is taking, as the 2020 letter to Turkey from the commissioner shows, is taking a more active role, and there has been efforts to encourage the UN agencies. Scholars at Risk has been a part of those efforts to encourage those UN agencies to see the fundamental importance of academic freedom. I don't know if Turkish folklore, tell me, Tanner, if it does, if Turkish folklore includes the story of the goose that laid golden eggs.
Of course.
Yeah. Tanner, should we remind people of the story? There was a farmer. There was a farmer and his wife who had a goose that laid not just eggs with shell, but this goose laid golden eggs. And they went to market with the golden eggs and they made money on it, of course. And they got greedy. And the farmer and his wife wanted more golden eggs. So they cut open the goose. They cut open the goose to extract more golden eggs. You see the moral.
Call from Montauk and
You see the moral. The universities.
Call from
Sometimes we do behave like geese, but sometimes
Oh.
the universities bring treasure to societies and to their regions and to the globe. Don't cut them open. Don't destroy them. And you will destroy them if you destroy freedom and autonomy. These are the conditions. Truth telling. These are the conditions of excellence and service. The conditions of a contribution to the common good.
Excellent. Thank you very much. This was really, really a nice analogy, and we'll keep that in mind, definitely. Definitely. Here's another question from Banu Can, who thanks you for your essential work and presentations. And then she asks, I will be very happy to hear more about the group's thoughts on the role of university constituents other than academics, like students, alumni, researchers, non-academic workers in upholding university values.
Well, I think it's a wonderful question. And again, I call on Sijbolt, who is in all his experience, at least in the United States, freedom to learn got a little bit bypassed by freedom to teach. And I think that students are enormously important. Indeed, Scholars at Risk organizes student advocacy groups. They each take a case of a prisoner in Egypt, for example, and serves as an advocate for that case. So that students are important. I think if we look at Belarusia today, and we see the students who are leaders in the fight against the dictator there. Students, alumni, yes. And of course, one of the organizations that's very powerful in American universities are alumni and alumni associations. And they can be very useful. They can also be very conservative, but they can be very useful if during their university experience, they're inculcated with the value of the search for truth, and not just the value of getting a degree so they can go out and make a lot of money. So that's it. And then there's, of course, ways of bringing the public in. We are a part of the public. Here, I think the so-called American land-grant university is important. By having extension courses throughout the state, by being of explicit service to the state. It's unfortunate in America, the big time sports is one of the deepest connections between the public. So maybe what we should do in the halves of all our big athletic competitions, basketball, football, maybe in the half, instead of having marching bands, we should have a marching band that sings about academic freedom. That's a joke, but a serious joke.
Thank you. Thank you.
In addition, Catharine was earlier on referring to the Magna Charta project of living values. We worked with a dozen of universities in our test phase. And in most of those cases, universities have started grassroots involvement debates on academic values. So not just leadership, not just deans, but all teachers, all support personnel, and above all, many students. I visited a couple of those universities myself, and I was struck by the important role those students and those student unions were playing in exactly understanding why these core values are so important. And I must say, in some parts of the world, we academics have become too, in a way, conceited and too individualistic in our scholarly pursuit to realize our social function and our responsibilities. And for many students, this is absolutely clear, that the inequalities of our societies, that the lack of equity, the unfairness in many respects, are ills that we should fight as universities, and that the utmost product of a researcher, a teacher at a university, is not the highest ranking publication in the highest ranking journal, but the good education of a generation of students to become professionals and core citizens in the future of our countries. I was involved in a project in South Africa where people were complaining that governments were constantly talking about European rankings and Chinese rankings about what the best universities were, and that governments were trying to make them change their profiles so they should be part of those rankings. And their students and teachers in the South African universities were fiercely opposing that tendency and said, this is not what we should measure. This is not what we should head for. We should head for our social responsibilities and our educational role and our fighting inequalities in our societies. And this clearly shows that talking university values with only rectors and deans or only tenured professors makes no sense. You have to involve the whole community.
Excellent. Thank you very much. We are running out of time. So I'm going to allow one more question, and that's going to be the end of it. And that's a related question to the goose story that comes from our own Yeshimarat again. So she's asking to Professor Stimson, and of course, Sijbolt, you can also answer. The authoritarian government wants to cut the goose open because the golden egg enriches the opposition. Those in power don't want more golden eggs. What do we do then?
Well, it depends how one defines the golden egg. Now, if the golden egg is the consequence of the Humboldtian ceaseless inquiry, that's one thing. If, however, the golden egg is narrowly defined, if the golden egg is defined as certain technocratic values, and I have nothing against technocracy, nothing. But if it's narrowly defined as helping an industrial policy, for example, that's another thing. But even if you narrowly define the golden egg as more technocratic or in policies or contributions to an industrial policy, even if you define the golden egg narrowly, you still mustn't cut the goose open. Because the goose produces its golden eggs according to its own rhythms and values. But I think it's a wonderful question, and how we interpret that myth. We can interpret it, and I very much appreciate the expansion of how we can interpret that particular story. I mean, I look at some of the Chinese universities with China's great tradition of culture. And now we see the clampdown in Hong Kong, and also the increasing control over some of the Chinese universities. It is a sorrow. It is a sorrow, because at some point there may be no eggs whatsoever.
Thank you, Kate.
Henry, can I thank you again and thank people for the question, and see what it's always a great pleasure to be in a gathering with Sijbolt, but I'm enormously thankful for the opportunity to be with you.
Thank you very much for joining us at this very early hour from New York. And it was a pleasure to have you and Sijbolt Noorda here. We still have another 4 minutes. Maybe I should ask one more question that has just come up to Sijbolt so that we can stop this, or Kate, you might also pitch in. So this comes from Banujan again. She says, I appreciate your emphasis on tenure. It is indeed a major concern in relation to academic freedom, but also regarding personal and communal societal consequences of precarization of academic labor. The percentage of precarious academic workers is alarming in most countries and has been steadily increasing. Would you like to elaborate more on ways and efforts to prevent this, which are discussed in the Magna Charta community?
Well, the relationship between the university as an academic organization and the university as an employer is a crucial one. And I think that what we see worldwide is an increase of flexible contracts, short contracts, instructors, researchers for a short period, and a downsizing of the number of tenured academics. And I'm certain that that is not a good development. We have to rebalance that. I'm not an advocate of a university with, say, 80% tenured people. A university should also be a workshop, an atelier where people come and go, where people not staying all their lives, but spend part of their careers. So flexibility and movement is important. But to maximize the financial flexibility of a university at the cost of the insecurity of many of the important young researchers and teachers in a university is just not acceptable. So this is one of the reasons why we need strong unions, why we need to stand together as academics to not just defend our own positions when we are tenured professors with a strong position over the authorities, but to think of those that are in less favorable situations. But I would like to expand that. There is also a very important case to be made to have closer links between universities and schools, primary and secondary education. I strongly believe in the wisdom of educational chains, of universities not staying in their own bubble, so to speak, but working with schools and collaborating. I mean, I know of some universities where professors spend a day a week or 2 days a week teaching in secondary education, and where teachers in secondary education spend 1 or 2 days a week in a university. And those are marvelous examples of a good understanding of what education really is, and a warm relationship that benefits students when they come from school and enter the university. So with the development of university success has also come a sort of exclusiveness of universities, moving away from the educational chain, and we should go the other way. So when you read the new Magna Charta statement, you will find an important statement on the need of education, of the total education, primary schools, secondary schools, and also lifelong learning education for those who are in a job already. And if there is one lesson, a positive lesson from the present pandemic, it is that many in universities have rediscovered the importance of education. Many of our colleagues are spending more time now on education because it must be redesigned, it must be remote, and so on, than they were used to. And I hope that will stay. And I hope that will lead to a rebalancing of universities, where the more individual research career loses some of its attraction and importance, and the educational role and responsibility becomes more important.
I agree, and I like the idea of collaboration, not to see primary to secondary to tertiary education as a ladder, which was a metaphor I used before. But it carries with it the idea that the tertiary is on top and closer to heaven. I think it's much better to see all of education within a nation or a region as part of a series of networks where we are interdependent. I am dependent on secondary education for the students I am to teach at New York University. But it is an ecology of a network where the nodes are of equal value and importance.
It's, I'm of my generation, I'm one of the last who started his career as a secondary school teacher before moving to the university. My father was a schoolmaster, so I grew up in schools and in the schoolmaster's house. So it's not lost on me the importance of relationships to schools. But I see younger career-making scientists who have no business in schools, and that's not good. We really should turn and find the connection and the connectivity with schools.
I agree.
Excellent. I think that's a good point where we can stop, because we can continue this for hours, but I know you have busy schedules. Thank you again very, very much for joining us and spending the time. And I take this opportunity to announce our next panel. And I see Agneta Blatt here, who will be joining us in that panel, again from Magna Charta Observatory's Governing Council, which would more be on the university autonomy, more than anything else, and its definition and the way of funding universities and so on. But again, Professor Noorda, Professor Stimson, thank you very much for being with us. It's been a pleasure, and we hope to see you on campus at some point in Istanbul soon.
Thank you very much, Tanner. I cannot wait but to return to Istanbul and enjoy your precious hospitality again. All the best to you, and thank you very much for this occasion.
Thanks again.
All the best. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, and thanks for all the participants. Thank you very much.